Conflict avoidance, how keeping the peace can set you up to fail. Some of us will do almost anything to avoid conflict. Yes, me included. We'll change the subject. We'll say it's fine. We'll tell ourselves it isn't worth bringing up. We'll rehearse the conversation 15 times in our head and never actually have it. We'll give people what they need without asking for what we need in return. And sometimes we even convince ourselves that this makes us easygoing or understanding or compassionate, the person who doesn't create problems. But what if avoiding conflict isn't actually keeping the peace? What if it's secretly setting us up to fail? Because there is something I had to learn. You cannot expect someone else to know what you refuse to tell them. And that sounds incredibly simple until you're the person who's terrified to say it. Conflict isn't the same as confrontation. I think some of us hear the word conflict and immediately imagine fighting. Raised voices, anger, someone leaving, someone being disappointed in us. But conflict doesn't have to look like any of those things. Sometimes conflict is simply, I don't agree. That hurt me. I need something different. I can't do that. I wish you had handled that differently. I need more from this relationship. That's not necessarily confrontation. That's communication. But when you've spent years learning that keeping everyone else comfortable keeps you comfortable, even those sentences can feel dangerous, so you don't say them. And initially that works. There's no argument. Nobody is upset. Nothing becomes uncomfortable. You successfully avoided the conflict, except the problem didn't disappear. You just postponed the conversation. The other person can't read your mind. Here's where this gets uncomfortable. Sometimes we desperately want someone to say the thing we're afraid to say ourselves. We leave clues. We make comments. We create opportunities. We hope they'll notice we're overwhelmed. We hope they'll notice we're hurt. We hope they'll offer the help we couldn't bring ourselves to request. And when they don't, it hurts. Because somewhere inside of us is the thought, if you really knew me, you would know. Or if you really cared, I wouldn't have to ask. But that's an incredibly difficult standard for another human being to meet. We have essentially given them a test without telling them they're taking one. And then we're disappointed when they fail. Sometimes people don't meet our needs because they don't care. That happens. But sometimes they don't meet our needs because we never told them what those needs were. Those are very different things. You can't expect yourself from someone else. This is another lesson I've had to learn. Not everyone has your heart. Not everyone has your compassion. Not everyone expresses love the way you do. Maybe you're the person who checks in. You remember birthdays. You notice when someone's voice sounds different. You offer before someone has to ask. You rearrange your schedule. You show up. And because that's what you do, you care. When you care about someone, it's easy to assume if they cared about me, they'd do the same. But they aren't you. That doesn't automatically make them selfish. It doesn't make them cold. And it certainly doesn't make them a bad person. They're different. People notice different things. People communicate differently. People express affection differently. People have different capacities. And sometimes the person who would never think to do what you would do still loves you tremendously. The question isn't whether they behave exactly like you. The question is whether the relationship as it exists meets the needs of both people in it. Unspoken expectations can become unfair contracts. Suppose I do something for you. I help you when you're struggling. I give you my time. I rearrange something because you need me. And I tell you there are no strings attached. Then 6 months later, I need something. You don't do for me what I did for you. And suddenly I'm furious. I did that for you. Okay, but did you know you were entering into an agreement? Because if I freely chose to give something to you, but secretly expected repayment later, I didn't actually give you a gift. I gave you a loan without telling you. That doesn't mean reciprocity doesn't matter. It does. If you're consistently giving everything to a relationship and receiving very little in return, you're allowed to recognize that pattern. You're allowed to change how much you give. You're allowed to decide that the relationship isn't meeting your needs. But there's a difference between recognizing a pattern and holding someone responsible for an agreement they never knew existed. Unspoken expectations aren't agreements. Reciprocity isn't accounting. Healthy relationships usually contain reciprocity, but reciprocity doesn't mean it's 50-50 every day. There may be seasons when one person carries more. Someone gets sick, someone loses a parent, someone has a baby, someone loses a job, someone simply doesn't have much to give for a while. Healthy relationships aren't spreadsheets. You shouldn't have to keep a running total. I called you 3 times. You only called me once. I watched your children twice. You owe me 2 favors. I bought dinner last time. Your turn. Because when every act of kindness creates a debt, we have to ask, is this a relationship or are we conducting transactions? Love can contain reciprocity without containing invoices. Accountability goes both ways. This may be the hardest part. We talk a lot about holding other people accountable, and sometimes that's necessary. But accountability that only travels in one direction isn't really accountability. Sometimes it's blame. Real accountability also asks, what did I contribute? What did I assume? What didn't I communicate? What expectations did I have that I never actually expressed? What bias am I bringing into this situation? Could I have misunderstood their intention? Did I say I'm fine and then became angry because they believed me? Did I repeatedly say yes when I wanted to say no? Did I give something freely and later decide they owed me for it? Those questions don't absolve anyone else of their behavior. You don't have to take responsibility for what somebody else did in order to take responsibility for what you did. Both things can exist at the same time. They may have hurt you, and you may have failed to communicate. They may have behaved badly, and you may have made assumptions. Accountability isn't deciding everything was your fault. It's being willing to look honestly at what part was yours. Avoiding conflict can create the conflict you feared. And this is the cruel irony of conflict avoidance. You stay quiet because you're afraid honesty might damage the relationship. But resentment begins accumulating. You accommodate, then accommodate again, then again. The other person thinks everything is okay because you've told them everything is okay. Eventually, you can't do it anymore. Maybe you explode. Maybe you shut down. Maybe you disappear emotionally. Maybe you end the relationship. And the other person says, I didn't even know anything was wrong. Meanwhile, you're thinking, how could you possibly not know? And both people may be telling the truth. You lived with the conflict every day. They didn't know the conflict existed. That's how avoiding one uncomfortable conversation can eventually create a devastating one. Speaking up doesn't guarantee the outcome you want. There's another reason we avoid these conversations. If we don't ask, we don't have to hear no. If we don't tell someone what we need, we don't have to discover that they can't or won't give it to us. Silence preserves possibility. Maybe they'll notice tomorrow. Maybe they'll change. Maybe they'll eventually understand. But communicating gives us information, and sometimes information hurts. You can clearly communicate what you need and discover that someone cannot meet that need. That doesn't necessarily make them bad, and it doesn't necessarily make you unreasonable. Sometimes 2 perfectly decent people simply cannot give each other what they need. That's painful. But knowing is still better than spending years waiting for someone to pass a test they don't know they're taking. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to say, I need help. I don't like that. That hurt. I can't do this today. I need you to show up differently. I disagree. I need some time. I don't want that. And asking isn't demanding. The other person still gets to respond. They get to have needs. They get to have boundaries. They get to disagree. And then you get to decide what their answer means for you. That's what communication gives us, not control, clarity. Maybe recovering from conflict avoidance isn't about becoming someone who loves confrontation. Maybe it's simply learning that temporary discomfort is survivable. That disagreement isn't abandonment. That expressing a need isn't selfish. That saying no isn't cruelty. And that someone else's disappointment doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Because keeping the peace at the expense of your own voice isn't really peace. It's silence. And eventually, silence has a cost. So perhaps the goal isn't to stop being compassionate. It isn't to stop giving. It isn't to expect less from friendship. It's to stop expecting other people to hear the things we're too afraid to say. Say what you mean. Ask for what you need. Listen to their answer. Own the part that's yours. Let them own the part that's theirs. And remember, the uncomfortable conversation you're avoiding today may be the conversation that saves you from a much more painful one tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in to for Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress. My name is Buffy. If you got value from this, definitely consider checking out Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress. And definitely consider liking and subscribing if you got value from this conversation. Thanks so much and hope you have a great rest of your day. Hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.